All of us take certain things about history as simple fact, despite not really knowing much about them. We might have picked up these ideas from a high school classroom, word of mouth, or just by clicking on whatever happens to catch our attention. Like maybe a YouTube video popped up in your feed purporting to tell the real truth about a historical topic. This is all totally normal. No one has the time to look into the research on every single topic ever, nor to fact check every little thing that we hear. And quite frankly, we often just don't care. A lot of the common misconceptions that result from this are at least pretty inconsequential. Like, it doesn't matter if John Deere really yelled, "The British are coming!" when he was warning of British troop movements before the kickoff of the American Revolutionary War. Though other times they can matter more, like with narratives surrounding events or figures of modern political importance. Che Guevara, for example. When the topic is actually one of some consequence, it can be very exciting to have our understanding of history challenged with new interpretations, and to think about why we took it for granted in the first place, and whether this new information might have broader implications. And what better way to demonstrate this than by looking at one particular historical event that I once had this exact experience with myself. In colonial Australia in 1835, John Batman, unrelated to Batman, led the only known attempt at negotiating some sort of formal treaty between British colonists and Australian Indigenous people. If you're Australian, you probably know the story. And if you're from the southeastern state of Victoria, you definitely do, because it's the founding story of the state capital, Melbourne. That or you forgot. It goes like this. Batman led a group of settlers known as the Port Phillip Association to, well, Port Phillip, part of what is now Melbourne. At the time, the area had yet to be officially colonised. Settler activities had mostly been limited to the original colony of New South Wales, hundreds of kilometres to the north, and Tasmania, an island to the south. Once there, they met with representatives of the local Aboriginal nation, the Kulin, and presented them with a treaty written in English. The treaty offered them mere trinkets, some blankets, axes, stuff like that, in exchange for them signing over their priceless ancestral land to Batman and Company. The Kulin had never even heard of white people before and obviously didn't speak English, so there's no way they could have possibly understood any of this. Also, the concept of land as something that was tradable was completely foreign to them. And for that matter, the very idea of two parties signing a piece of paper to agree to something was completely unknown to them. So, Batman either coerced them into making marks on a treaty that they did not understand, or just outright forged their signatures, and then used this to try and support the laughable idea that they just kind of consensually handed their land over to him. The treaty was then declared null and void by the government because Batman, a private citizen, had no power to negotiate on behalf of the king, which was a good thing as Batman had clearly tricked the Aboriginal people. There's no way that they ever would have just given up their land like that if they'd even remotely understood. And yeah, they wouldn't have. And they didn't, because that's not actually what happened. And it wasn't necessarily a good thing that the treaty wasn't allowed to stand. Why? Well, you gotta watch the video to find out. You might be wondering, what's wrong with that story? Lots of colonists weren't exactly upstanding folks, and they did lots of terrible things to Indigenous people, so it makes perfect sense. And you'd be right. Actually, Batman and others in his party were themselves guilty of murdering Aboriginal people in Tasmania. None of that is the issue. Actually, it's a very logical conclusion to draw. And that's why, for a very long time, many historians took it for granted too. I was even taught that version of the story in a university class. The primary problem here is that the agency of the Indigenous Kulin people is not considered at all in any of this. No one's asking any questions about why they might have done what they did, if perhaps they could have had their own motivations, their own plans, and their own understanding of the agreement. They're treated simply as unfortunate and ultimately passive victims of inevitable colonial expansion. And so the common story of the treaty, despite on the surface being very sympathetic towards the Kulin, is actually very reductive. Additionally, by focusing on Batman's supposed deception, we avoid asking some of the important questions that the treaty and its subsequent annulment might raise about colonialism, both in Australia and in general. In 2008, Robert Kenny became one of the first historians to really give the Kulin their due. The most important question that he asked, because it leads into everything else, was just what did the Kulin really know about white people and their settlement in Australia? Well, they had trade routes that stretched deep into New South Wales to the north, which was the centre of European settlement at the time. It's practically certain that at some point in the 47 years since 1788, the year when the first European colonists arrived, word would have travelled about colonisation, and of the fact that Aboriginal societies had been devastated wherever the settlers had expanded. After all, Port Jackson in New South Wales is only 900 kilometres from Port Phillip in Melbourne, where the treaty was first signed. That's about 560 miles. And the Kulin Nation was an alliance of 5 different groups whose territory stretched about 200 kilometres to the north, and who, like most Aboriginal people, frequently travelled long distances. They also had very efficient methods of long-distance messaging, but honestly, the proximity and the existence of the trade routes is enough. In 47 years, they would have heard plenty of news of what was going on up north. It's kind of ridiculous that no one among the many millions of Australians who've taken this story at face value, myself included, had considered this before. I guess it speaks to how readily we can just accept implausible assumptions, like the idea that the Kulin just knew nothing about white settlement. There's also the very important fact that Batman and his company were not the first white people in Victoria, or Melbourne, or even Port Phillip. Abortive attempts to settle the area had been made twice before, in 1803 and 1828, and Tasmania, which the British invaded in 1803, is a relatively short boat journey away. Settlers had been making the trip across the Bass Strait to the Victorian coast for decades. As James Boyce writes in his book on the founding of Melbourne, the view that the Aborigines of the Port Phillip district were unfamiliar with white people, and thus separated from them by an impenetrable cultural gulf, relies on an analysis that has been seriously distorted by the ignorance of the sealers, whalers and wattlebark collectors, the first European colonisers of Port Phillip. Sealers had relations with the Aborigines stretching back over 30 years. Indeed, the first group of Aborigines that Batman encountered in Port Phillip was, in his words, afraid I should take them by force and ill-use them, as some of their tribe had been already. So, whether they personally had direct experience with white people or not, knowledge of them was still widespread among the Kulin, and their fear at first contact indicates that they already thought of white people as potential aggressors. Kenny provides further evidence of this, stating that there are numerous first contact experiences which show that Aboriginal groups in Victoria had heard of the white man but not experienced him directly. The white man in these stories is clearly something to be wary of, if not feared as monstrous. This perception of white people was almost certainly formed through direct experiences with settlers crossing from Tasmania and news of colonisation from the north. So, if the Kulin already had such negative ideas of white people before meeting with Batman, then we have to ask, how might this have affected their dealings with him? They saw white settlers as a threat to their people, and they vastly outnumbered his party of just a couple dozen. If they wanted to, they could have attacked and just easily dispatched them, or at least avoided them entirely. But they didn't. They were actually the ones who approached and initiated first contact after a few days of observing them from afar. They wanted to negotiate. That much is really obvious when we lay it out like this, and when we think of them as people with agency like we do for the European settlers. This is an issue that goes far beyond just Australian history. Basically, in any instance where Europeans interacted with another culture, everything about the Europeans is centred, while the other party is rarely considered with anything resembling the same depth. They're just seen as sort of passive victims. Now, don't get me wrong here. In the majority of cases, yeah, they were victims, but they weren't passive. They had their own motivations, they made their own decisions, and in many cases they resisted, sometimes very successfully, whether it be through violent means, through adapting, or just through negotiation. So, both sides, not just the European one, went into the meeting with the intention to negotiate. What then was negotiated, and was it mutually understood? To answer those questions, we have to look at the capacity for cross-cultural understanding between the two parties. Batman's group wasn't only white. They also had 7 English-speaking Aboriginal men from New South Wales with them. Now, Aboriginal people have many different languages, so none of them spoke a Kulin language, but still, some of them were only a few cultural groups removed, so it's likely that there was at least some degree of mutual intelligibility. But there was definitely much more cultural understanding between them, especially since these men were very experienced in such negotiations. 2 of them had been employed by Tasmanian settlers in that capacity for the last 6 years, and so they were familiar with a vast array of Aboriginal cultural practices and laws, far beyond just those of their own culture. Batman and the white men in his party were also very experienced in these matters. While it can't be denied that many of them were guilty of atrocities against Aboriginal people in Tasmania, Aboriginal resistance to the invasion there was effective enough that eventually the settlers started to see making peace as within their own interest. So eventually there were conciliation efforts there, and many of the men in Batman's party were intimately involved in them for the last 5 years. And the Kulin, for their part, were a political alliance of 5 different Aboriginal groups who had much experience with both external diplomacy and internal politics. So both sides almost certainly had a very good understanding of the negotiations and the rituals that were being undertaken. In fact, Batman's party chose to base their treaty on the antiquated feudal practice of enfeoffment. Oh, thank God. They might have done this intentionally based on their knowledge of Aboriginal practices, because enfeoffment was very similar to Aboriginal land use ceremonies. At the conclusion of negotiations, the Kulin performed a tanderum, a ceremony that grants temporary access to their land, very similar to those of other Aboriginal peoples. This ceremony involves the handing over of soil, as does enfeoffment, and enfeoffment, like the tanderum, does not imply a transfer of ownership, but rather the temporary right to use the land, conditional on terms being upheld. Part of the treaty involved a gift of goods. In the common version of this story, these goods are said to have been merely worthless trinkets. It's true that they weren't really worth much money in European terms, but Kenny makes a compelling argument that they were much more useful to Aboriginal society, which obviously wasn't that concerned with their monetary value. The deed gave over, in the first instance, 20 pairs of blankets, 30 tomahawks, 100 knives, 50 pairs of scissors, 30 looking glasses, 200 handkerchiefs, 100 pounds of flour, and 6 shirts. These goods were substantial in Kulin terms. We may scoff at handkerchiefs and mirrors, but to people with stone axes, the steel and iron of the knives, tomahawks, and scissors represented a technological leap. Additionally, there was a much larger rent of similar goods, and the treaty stated that it would be voided if this was not forthcoming. So, the ultimate owners of the land were still the Kulin, and Batman's party would have been given the right to live on their land without displacing them, provided that the yearly rent of goods continued. So the terms of this treaty were very much compatible both with the practices of the Tandarum and of enfeoffment, since they both granted only temporary, conditional land use. Both sides also would have had clear motivations to come to an agreement like this. Batman and his company also hoped that by showing the colonial government that he had an agreement with the local Aboriginal people, they would then be granted exclusive ownership of their land under British law. So to that end, he lied to the British officials about the extent of what had been agreed, making the ridiculous claim that the Kulin had just kind of handed over 600,000 acres of land to him, and he probably even forged the signatures on the treaty. But Batman also knew that the Aboriginal people didn't exactly care about British law. Obviously, they wouldn't simply leave their land to him if he showed up with a deed and said, "Hey, this is mine." And the 17 people that made up the Port Phillip Association couldn't possibly hope to establish themselves on such a wide swath of land without Aboriginal cooperation. As Boyce puts it, in considering a costly private scheme, which involved the colonisation of some of the most heavily populated grasslands in Australia by a small group of hopelessly outnumbered whites without military support or official backing, the practical necessity of a negotiated agreement with the Aborigines was paramount. The treaty, therefore, served a dual purpose in 2 different legal systems: to convince, and honestly defraud, the British authorities to give the Port Phillip Association the exclusive right to settle on Kulin land among Europeans, and to secure the right under Kulin law to live on their land. among them rather than displacing them. Boyce continues, Batman and his negotiating team, who had been exposed to similar customs elsewhere, were too experienced in cross-cultural contact to have been in any doubt that the Tanderrum ceremony only concerned land access rather than ownership, regardless of what they told the British. Furthermore, Batman did not envisage the uncontrolled invasion of white people that was soon to follow. Indeed, his express purpose was to exclude other Britons from making land claims. Batman only sought permission for a comparatively small party of Europeans to live on Aboriginal land. He didn't expect the Aborigines to leave the land, or imagine that his possession would end theirs. He was hoping for a profitable coexistence. In Batman's private writings, this is also clear. The chiefs appeared most fully to comprehend my proposals, and much delighted with the prospect of having me to live amongst them. In fact, Batman never let on any hint that he had intended to mislead the Kulin. Rather, he appeared genuinely thrilled at what had been achieved. As Boyce writes, if the treaty was nothing more than a ruse played on the British government, then there was no reason for him to be so excited by his discussions with the Aborigines. Batman may have tried to deceive the British government, but he was not trying to deceive the Kulin. Of course, all of this was self-serving. Batman and his party were, for the most part, not interested in humanitarian concerns. They simply had a whole lot to gain from being the only Europeans allowed to live on the Kulin's vast land, and the cooperation of thousands of Aboriginal people would have been of great benefit. And if we look at the Kulin's potential motivations, taking into account what they knew about white settlement, then it's clear that this arrangement was to their benefit too. What better way to avoid the devastation that settlement had brought to Aboriginal people elsewhere than by limiting the number of Europeans allowed to live on their land? As Kenny puts, if Batman's aim was to limit settlement to himself and his associates, the clan heads of the Kulin could have made a very informed decision. They may have hoped to reach some accommodation of the settlers, an agreement which limited settlement on their land and provided them with coveted items. The treaty, therefore, might be seen as diplomacy on the frontier, an attempt by the Kulin to at least curtail the destruction which they had heard occurred to their north. Rather than mutual incomprehension between the Port Phillip Association and the Kulin, there was mutual interest. Quite different than the usual story of the naive, incapable Kulin being duped by the evil trickster, Batman. Events in the years following the treaty also provide very strong evidence that both sides understood that an agreement had been made. When Governor Burke of New South Wales, the highest British authority in the colony at the time, rendered the treaty null and void under British law a few months later, that meant absolutely nothing to the Kulin. As far as they were concerned, there was an agreement under their laws, and they upheld it, and they expected the other side to do so as well, and the British authorities knew that. So when soon afterwards large amounts of settlers began to flood onto Kulin land, they continued to abide by its terms. Well, aside from the limiting the number of white settlers part. They did so at least partly for 4 years, until the settlement was large enough that they could just steal the land by force. So basically for as long as they needed the Kulin's cooperation. Initially, the Port Phillip Association, despite their land grant having been denied, were in charge of ensuring compliance with the treaty terms. Within days of the agreement being reached, they set up ration stations and began to provide the Kulin with the agreed upon goods. And for 3 months, Batman's party lived among them. And by all accounts, the Kulin were very happy with this new arrangement. And in August 1835, 2 months after the treaty was signed, William Buckley, an escaped convict who had lived with the Kulin for the last 35 years, yeah, I kind of forgot to mention that they had their own white guy until now, was asked to assure the Aboriginal people that ample food would continue to be supplied, and that justice would be served if any white people committed crimes against them. In other words, to assure them that the settlers were still committed to upholding the treaty. And indeed, over the next year, they did exactly that, joining the Kulin in defending their land from the marauding white settlers from Tasmania who had plagued them over the previous decades. Then, in May 1836, right before the treaty's anniversary, the Port Phillip Association delivered the agreed upon yearly rent of goods ahead of time. In late 1836, as more and more white settlers flooded unregulated into the Melbourne area, the colonial government assumed direct control of settler activities there. John Wedge, one of the members of the Port Phillip Association, proposed to the colonial authorities measures through which the treaty may continue to be maintained, despite the influx of settlers beyond what had been agreed. He suggested financial incentives for settlers to share land land of Aboriginal people rather than displacing them, and the establishment of more stations to deliver treaty goods to the Kulin. This, Wedge wrote, would be observing the terms agreed upon by Mr. Batman with the native tribes, and the fulfillment of which the colonial government took upon itself to perform. So initially, the government was committed to compliance with the treaty. They also paid a hefty sum of £7,000 to the Port Phillip Association, likely to compensate them for what they had spent on maintaining the treaty until that point. But in 1837, a new regime stopped complying with the treaty, instead mandating that Aboriginal people were not to receive any goods that they hadn't worked for. Many settlers noted that the Kulin, nonetheless, still expected to be supplied with the agreed upon goods, and that as time went by, they became more hostile. Kenny writes that Wedge believed that an agreement had been undertaken, and that the lack of compliance with the agreement by Europeans over the following few years was the reason for the Kulin's growing unrest. The lawyer who had written the treaty, Joseph Gillibrand, disappeared in early 1837. He is commonly believed to have been killed by some Kulin people. That would have made him one of the first victims of their unrest, which can't be coincidental. During the previous 2 years, they definitely would have caught wind of the fact that he was the treaty's author. Unfamiliar with European cultural practices, they probably thought that the guy who wrote the treaty was the one who was responsible for upholding it. In 2017, Lyndall Ryan made a convincing argument that Billy Bellery, one of the most important leaders among the Kulin and a treaty signatory, took on the role as the treaty's primary arbiter from the Kulin side. In this capacity, he lived with the white people in the fledgling Melbourne settlement, learned English, and very often engaged with settler officials, in what, at least from his perspective, was a treaty-affirming role. Billy Bellery was noted by settlers for his commitment to peace and cooperation, which Ryan argues was due to his belief in upholding the treaty, even as white society began to ignore it. And in 1839, when the government finally felt comfortable enough in their strength in numbers to antagonise the Kulin, they began to deny their entry into Melbourne, the settlement that they had spent the last 4 years helping to build. This would have been seen as a flagrant violation of the treaty, of which cooperation and coexistence was a key part. And Billy Bellery protested this, making direct reference to Batman's treaty in the process. Why you want blackfellows away? Plenty long time ago, very good Batman come here. Blackfellows stop long time. All blackfellows, plenty bread, plenty sugar, etc, etc. Now he obviously didn't speak great English, but his mentioning of Aboriginal people stopping long time and having plenty bread, plenty sugar, etc. refers to Aboriginal people and settlers having lived among one another in the Melbourne settlement in the previous years, as agreed to in the treaty. As the government and settlers continued to violate the terms of the treaty, relations deteriorated to the point where they were no longer a remarkable exception, but rather characterised by the same violent dispossession as in the rest of Australia. I think it's clear by this point that there's a lot more to the treaty than the common version of the story even comes close to representing. Everyone involved understood its implications very well, and it was not Batman and his company who violated its terms, but rather the government and other settlers. So, what can we glean from this new understanding of the treaty? Well, firstly, that popular understandings of history that are taken as simple, common sense truths are sometimes not only very reductive, but also totally wrong. Secondly, it says a lot about how agency is often denied to native peoples in histories of colonialism. As this example shows, even without having written sources that come directly from them, we can still glean a whole lot about their intentions and actions by critically examining settler sources and simply thinking more about their side of things. The Kulin proved themselves politically adept and very open to cooperation with people of a drastically different culture, contrary to common beliefs that native peoples weren't even capable of conceiving such things. As James Boyce wrote, "It is worth remembering that if the Port Phillip Association's exclusive right to colonize had been upheld, the Kulin's decision to negotiate with Batman would now be celebrated as an act of political genius." It also says something about how Indigenous dispossession is understood and sometimes excused. Contrary to popular belief, the treaty was not declared null and void because Batman had no right to negotiate on behalf of the king, but rather because according to the colonial government, The British Crown already owned the Kulins' land, in contrast to other British colonies where they at least pretended to have come to terms with the original owners of the land in order to form a basis for land rights in the British legal system. All of Australia was simply assumed to be under the Crown's ownership from the moment of first landing, and all subsequent grants of land therefore came from the Crown. So, 47 years later, when Batman tried to treat with the Kulin and therefore recognise their land ownership, the colony's very legal foundation was challenged. This was the one and only reason that the treaty was voided. Lord Glenelg, the head of the British Colonial Office, upon hearing of Batman's treaty, said that such a concession would subvert the foundation on which all property rights in New South Wales at present rest. And later, George Grey, the first governor of South Australia, made this same observation. To admit that Aboriginal people owned any land in Australia was to admit that they owned all of it. Batman's treaty forced the colonial authorities to acknowledge the injustice of Indigenous dispossession, to admit that this made no sense even in their own legal system. And then they did nothing about it. And it was hardly just the government that was guilty here. Settler society as a whole was very happy to take advantage. When Batman's treaty was voided, this signalled that the entire Australian landmass was free for the taking, and scores of settlers quickly flooded into Victoria and robbed Aboriginal people of their land. This legal doctrine that denied Aboriginal people their land rights, first acknowledged in the wake of Batman's treaty, remained in force until the Mabo decision in 1992, for 157 years. By incorrectly framing John Batman as some sort of duplicitous trickster who conned the naive Kulin out of their priceless land, this whole discussion can be conveniently avoided. The wider implications of the treaty and the reaction to it, which show that both the government and settler society as a whole were enthusiastic and willing land thieves, this discussion can be conveniently avoided. It lets us distance ourselves from it, even if we today live on this same stolen land. But what I personally think is the most important thing that the real story of Batman's treaty shows is that it challenges some commonly taken for granted ideas about colonialism. It's often taken for granted that colonialism as it happened was simply inevitable, and this is used to justify settler crimes. Because, well, if it wasn't them who did it, it would have been someone else eventually anyway. But Batman's treaty shows that different models of colonization, consensual and mutually beneficial, were not only theoretically possible, but also conceived at the time and almost put into practice, and by a bunch of murderers no less. So even if we accept the notion that European colonists simply could not resist the urge to go and settle in distant, already occupied lands, the way in which they did so can't be so easily excused. The insatiable greed and brutality of imperial governments and many of the settlers themselves were what prevented something different. Reconciliation between settlers and Australian Indigenous people, supposedly still ongoing today, could have instead begun on that fateful day back in 1835. The treaty is not, as is commonly believed, an isolated instance of frontier trickery by a private citizen. It's much different and more important than that. It represents a defining junction in Australian and world history, where the other route, the road not travelled, could have led to much different outcomes. Thanks for watching this video, I hope you learned something. If you liked it, why not subscribe for more or support me on Patreon or whatever. But you do you, I'm not your boss. Now I'd just like to thank all of my patrons and especially my $25 plus patrons. Fer Tahon, Pout, Tonga Parutu Neha, Super Pancake Man, Shub, Jesse Hosick, and my $10 plus patrons. Young Trotsky, Christoph Kaczynski, Mamushin, Nico Del Sesto, One Trash Boy, Insurgente, Morimer, Mitsuki Kazan, Mubashir Razvi, Cincione Brezgal, Industrial Robot, Christopher Strom, Jet with 2 T's, Jilly Bean, and Violet Rain. See ya!